Now, the submarine has been around in one form or another since the American Civil War, believe it or not. The basic principles were worked out, the idea that you could flood compartments and then empty them again so the thing would go up and down. It has a leaky bit, and it has a perfectly, it must be perfectly, waterproof bit. Well, to be honest, some of the early ones didn't work and all the crew drowned. But anyway, the idea that a thing like a submarine, this massive contraption, can be made perfectly and utterly reliably waterproof leads me to wonder why mobile phones aren't. Why is a mobile phone destroyed if you so much as sneeze on it and get a bit of bogey in one of the cracks? There's no reason why a mobile phone shouldn't be completely waterproof in my view, but at least, you know, shower and splash of beer proof. Otherwise you go to the shop, you say my mobile phone's not working, and they put it in an X-ray scanner or something and they say, oh yes, it's got water damage, I'm afraid you've invalidated your warranty. Bollocks. It's just a plot to sell us stuff. It would be like making saucepans with holes in. You know, a tiny little bit that would break the instant you touched it with a spoon. Oh, well, I'm afraid you've touched it with a spoon. So, yes, but it's a saucepan. Oh, I'm afraid you've used your mobile phone in the rain. Well, it rains, doesn't it? It's England.
One of the reasons I wanted to do this question was just idle curiosity, because I fly light aircraft, and one of the things you have to learn to pass the written bits of the exam are temperature changes, temperature falls, because it affects something called performance altitude, i.e. how the aeroplane will perform, how powerful the engine will be, and how well the wings will provide lift relative to a standard atmospheric day, a standard temperature, a standard pressure, and so on. That varies by the temperature at the altitude you're at, and so on. And you learn that the adiabatic lapse rate is approximately 2 degrees per 1,000 feet you go up. That becomes significant. Not very significant if you're flying around England and just flying up to a few thousand feet, but if you take off from somewhere very high up, or even somewhere very low down on a hot or a cold day, that sort of thing can make a difference, especially if the aeroplane is very heavily loaded. But apart from that, it is quite interesting that people think it must get hotter as you go higher, because in a room that's undoubtedly true. All the hot air ends up settling up in the roof, i.e. miles above your head and where you need to be warm, and the bit down here remains freezing cold. But it's not true of the atmosphere as a whole. You're better off, if you want to be warm, staying near the ground. And if you go to a very hot country, one of the best ways to cool down is go up a mountain. It's why Europeans in places like India in the old days used to go to tea plantations up in places like Darjeeling. It was high up, it was cooler. Simple as that. The thing that intrigues me about evolution, well, the thing that troubles me about it, if I'm honest, is that firstly, it is, as I understand it, still only a theory. That's why we call it the theory of evolution. There isn't any absolute proof, and there are still a lot of gaps in it, but it is beginning to make a great deal of sense. But the trouble is, evolution is potentially extremely boring, because it's millions and millions and millions of years just to get your eyeball to move from the side of your head round to somewhere near the front. Whereas creation myths, assuming they are myths, are much more romantic. They're just lovely, the idea that things spring from the earth or from the word of a god or something like that. That's nice, that makes for a better story. And the appreciator of poetry in me prefers creationism, but my rather sort of bar humbug mind prefers the precision of the scientific explanation, which is of course evolution. It's very, very thoroughly worked out in as far as we understand it. So I wouldn't completely dismiss creation stories, because they're nice, and you can think of them anyway as allegories for something else, which you can't really do with evolution. It's not an allegory for something else, it's absolute, it's presented as what happened. The unfortunate thing is, it happened over an inconceivably long time. It would make even, you know, the entire back catalogue of EastEnders look like the twinkle of an eye. That's how dull it is. I don't have any wisdom teeth, which would suggest that I am slightly more evolved than my younger brother, because I believe he does. I don't actually think that's evidence of evolution, because he's only 2.5 years younger than me, and really not much happens to the human species over 2.5 years. Not much happens over 2,500 years. We're talking actually about thousands and thousands and thousands of generations to make any perceivable change. And then we're only talking about what's happened to humans as we understand them, i.e. from the sort of Homo sapien or Homo erectus or whatever it was that we've decided we became vaguely human. There's everything that happened before that as well, and all those millions of years in which there were dinosaurs and dragons and giant trolls, and are you being served and it ain't half hot, mum? I mean, it's an inconceivably long story, and the pace is extremely slow. It makes those Russian novels look like limericks. Many years ago, my dad ran various small steel factories and the like, and he briefly took over a small magnet making factory, and he gave me a handful of magnets that they made, most of them little ones, but one of them was this giant horseshoe magnet with a keeper. So it's painted red. It's like the magnet that you'd have in a cartoon with some wavy lines coming out of it to show magnetism, with the keeper on the bottom. And this has become known in my house. It sits on a shelf out of reach for the most part. It's called Danger Magnet, because it's so strong that if you hold the magnet and the keeper, that's the bit that you put across the two poles, if you bring them together and you've got your finger in the way, at about that distance, it suddenly goes bang on your finger. And I've only done it once, and it hurts like hell. It's so strong. And it's so strong that actually it's quite a risky thing to handle. I know that sounds stupid, it's just a magnet. This is a train, which is running on electric motors, which rely on the principle of magnetism and the electromotive force to work. We could thank Tesla and Westinghouse for a lot of the work on that. I think that's right, isn't it? Yes. Anyway, where was I on? Yes, this a danger magnet it is only a magnet. It doesn't sound very threatening, but it is so strong that you do actually have to handle it quite carefully, because if you stride past the fridge, which is made of mild steel and therefore very magnetic, with this thing in your hand, you'll be walking normally, and then bang, your arm is attached to the fridge. If you get anything stuck on danger magnet, it's very difficult to get it off. A paperclip, or especially anything like metal filings, if they're on there, you're not going to get them off. You're not going to be able to pull them off with your fingers. It's impossible. It's so powerful. I think it may actually be slightly affecting the rotation of the Earth and interfering with time itself. It's why I haven't aged as much as my colleagues. I have yet to work out what the point of a mosquito is, other than to spread disease. And I suppose they must be the most dangerous creature in the world, because malaria is such a massive problem. There must have been more disease and misery spread by that tiny little thing than bullets or bombs or anything like that. What is the point of a mosquito? What is the point of a wasp? What is the point of Michael Gove? You know, there are many questions like this. I'm not attracted to mosquitoes. I've often observed this without ever really understanding why, and I thought it might be a myth that some people are more attractive than others, but it turns out it isn't. But I should think in my whole life I've probably suffered 10 mosquito bites. I've spent quite a lot of time in, tropical places and what have you. I just assumed I'd taste disgusting. And actually, as a kid, we only ever went camping in Devon and Cornwall, and there aren't any mosquitoes down there as far as I know. Yes, we are about to enter the zettabyte era, and I suppose somebody will champion the first pocket device or electronic tablet or whatever to have 1 zettabyte of memory, won't it? That'll be terribly exciting. But we will fill it up. Computer memory is like kitchen cupboards. The first computer I owned was in 1994, and it had 1.4 megabytes of memory, and I didn't use it up. If a gigabyte is represented by a glass of water, the volume of a glass of water, then a zettabyte apparently represents the volume of the Great Wall of China, which, as we know, is visible from space. So think how big your computer's going to be. Yeah. Well, yes. All right. So when? I spent a lot of time working out how to explain this, because it's not complicated base 2, it's zeros and ones, or noughts and ones. And I was thinking, we count in base 10 because we have 10 fingers. That's the accepted theory. I mean, we didn't always do that. Some ancient people, I think the Babylonians or someone like that, had sexagesimal systems based on 60s, and Indian currency works in multiples of 10,000 in some cases. But anyway, basically, we're a base 10 people. We've got 10 fingers, but of course we've actually got 9 numerals plus the naught. So I was going to say a computer only has 2 fingers, but it doesn't. It only has 1 finger, because the other one is naught, which is no fingers. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So this finger to the left is counting how many times this finger has gone up, which represents 1. But when you get to 2, there isn't a 2, it's 1 in that column. Base 2 is slightly confusing. Is base 3 any less confusing? That would go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, 1, 1 would be... No. Yes, 5 in base 3. You can draw it on a piece of paper, it makes it a lot easier. What I don't know is, if we'd been born with 5 fingers or 7 fingers, would we be able to count in base 7? Presumably we would, but it's difficult to know because it feels so unnatural. We'd have to have a different set of words for it as well, or drop a few words. And I've never seen any experiments done in base 11. It must be possible, but we don't have a name for the extra digit, do we? So if you wanted to do base 12, it would have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I suppose 11, 12. And then the next number would be 12. So 1, 0 would be 12, and 1, 1 would actually be 13. Base 10 is best, all things considered. Why did I choose this question? Because I'm quite intrigued by computers, this fact that they are layer upon layer upon layer of yes and no. For one character to form on the screen, apart from the fact that it has to know where to put it and so on, it needs a byte to make the letter B or something. That's how much information you need to turn those bits of the screen either on or off to form that shape. And that's the sort of the simplest thing a modern computer can do, display a character. So when you look at it, rendering graphics and so on, it's that same technology, that same combination of noughts and ones, layer upon layer, inconceivable layering of all that stuff, but that's still all it is. It's still yes and no, forwards and backwards, up or down, north or south, however you want to think about it, but it's still the same thing. It's one or the other, but nothing else. They are completely thick computers. In fact, video streaming and video storage takes up a huge amount of memory on computers, and it's the reason we need bigger and bigger memories, because there's more and more of what we used to call television on computers. Things such as this, me talking to you now, this would have been a TV program in the old days. Well, it wouldn't actually, because they'd have said, we're not showing that rubbish. But nobody can stop us here, because it's the internet, and you could subscribe to more of this rubbish by just clicking the subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. That's another 3 megabytes gone. I've seen some 3D animation, but I've never seen Avatar's the most famous 3D film, I suppose, isn't it? And there's been another one recently. There you go, you see, I haven't seen it because I've just never been to see a 3D film. I don't watch a film thinking, God, I wish this was in 3D. It's like I don't read a novel and think, I wish this had more pictures in it. You just don't. I accept the idea that drama and storytelling is an abstract thing, and that much of the work has to go on inside your own brain, like it does when you listen to the radio. If things like 3D were so important, radio wouldn't work. That's one of the things that bothers me about television. Everybody, well, a lot of people who work in television say, oh, you can't really say that to camera, or we can't do that as a piece because it's a bit long and people will get bored. But I think, well, if that were true, radio wouldn't be popular, and it's never been more popular. So I don't think the audience needs to be nannied. People snore as they get older. I'm 50 now, so I'm pretty ancient, and a lot of my friends have said to me, well, I know I snore because my wife has said you snore, and has often just moved out or gone back to mother or whatever. Apparently I snore sometimes, but of course I don't know because I'm asleep. Very occasionally, if you fall asleep somewhere slightly inappropriate, like on a partly reclined aeroplane seat, or even just, I don't know, watching the telly and your head falls back on the back of the sofa, you do wake yourself up with a sudden snore. I'm sure everybody's done that. You're falling asleep and you go like that, and you make this awful pig noise, and then you wake up and you pretend that you had something up your nose. But the fact is you fell asleep and you snored. The interesting thing about snoring is that people snore when they're asleep, obviously, because they are relaxed, and also they don't realise they're doing it. But are there any people who snore when they're awake? Are there any people whose breathing is just sort of... There must be. There must be some people with really flappy mouths that just snore constantly. That'd be worse than having unending hiccups, wouldn't it? Do I know any famous people that snore? Well, I haven't slept with any famous people recently, but I'm sure famous people aren't immune to this sort of thing. The Queen may well snore as well, and fart. I mean, she must do, otherwise she'd explode. She's only human. Famous people snoring? Probably. I mean, I do know someone, if I'm honest, who's had the operation done on his throat because apparently he snored appallingly and his wife just wanted to kill him. He said it was very uncomfortable afterwards. Basically, you've had your throat sliced up, and he's never told me whether or not it works. If it didn't, I could imagine he's quite depressed because it would have cost a lot of money, no doubt, and it would have been very uncomfortable, and he would have had to have eaten tepid, finely liquidized soup and warm milk. He'll have had to, oh God, awful. And he probably still snores and his wife still hates him. This is why men have sheds, somewhere to snore in peace.
Do you sleep on your back?
No, I tend to sleep in a sort of very timid, defensive, fetal position. I don't know what that means. I'm sure the trick cyclists will tell me that says something very important about my inner self. I don't know what it is. I just find it more comfortable. Some dogs snore, don't they? You get animals that snore. Purring in cats is almost like a sort of snoring, isn't it? A very controlled. Because I've got two cats. Well, my missus has got two cats, which I have to tolerate. But one of them purrs very deeply, and then he almost sort of chokes on his own purr. So he's going, and then he goes like that, as if he swallowed his own tongue. He is thick, though. Honestly, his brain is the size of a split lentil at best, and probably made of the same stuff. He can barely walk. He's so stupid. My girlfriend has said to me, "You're snoring," and I say, "No, I'm lying here reading my book," and I think I'm reading my book. But I must be asleep and dreaming I'm reading the book and actually making a snorting noise because I'm lying on my back. This is all a bit personal, isn't it, really? Do you really want to put this on YouTube? It was a pretty annoying noise. So you need a form of noise-cancelling headphones that cancels it for everybody else. Scissors does the job equally well, though. If you just lean across and do that, that tends to cure the problem. You can get left-handed shotguns and rifles. Yes, the stock of a shotgun typically has a slight, well, I mean, in layman's terms, a bit of a kink in it, so that as you hold it, the barrel becomes in line with your eye. But if you want to fire it left-handed, obviously you have to make the stock, the wooden bit, the other way around. But not everybody recognises this because the British Army famously commissioned an assault rifle that you couldn't use left-handedly because the ejector slot for the spent cartridges was about there. So if you're a lefty, every time you fired it, the hot cartridge hit you in the eyeball. Hopeless. It's no wonder we lost the empire, really. Now, lefties are more angry and historically better at fighting because they have the advantage of surprise using their dominant left fist, I suppose. I don't know any left-handers who are fighty. I know... Yeah, actually, the left-handed people I know aren't particularly angry, I don't think, or at least they're not angry about being left-handed. The weird thing is that all the left-handed people I've known in life I don't really like, but I don't think that means anything. I think that is just an enormous coincidence. There are only a few of them, so it's not a big enough sample. I think they just happen to be rather unpleasant people. That they are left-handed is coincidental. I've got a pair of left-handed scissors somewhere in a drawer, and I don't know how I came by them, but they do feel wrong. The interesting thing is in metalwork you have left-handed and right-handed tin snips for cutting very thin sheet metal, and that actually indicates which side the cut-away bit goes. So on, let me get this right-handed tin snips, the waste falls away to that side, so you can go around a left-hand bend. Am I getting this right, Caroline? Yes. On the left-handed tin snips, you can follow a curve that way and the waste falls to that side, but they're both right-handed tools. It would be quite difficult to use them with your left hand, or would it? I don't know. That might just be because I'm right-handed. Yeah, being normal can be a burden sometimes. I think we all know that not that long ago in history, probably less than 100 years ago, people who were left-handed, school children, were often forced. People tried to train them to be right-handed because that would be better for them. They wouldn't be so weird. So they would have their left hands restrained, tied to their legs or tied behind their backs or touched with burning hot irons or something to try and get them to right left-hand. But of course it doesn't work. My sister is sort of half left-handed. It's weird actually because she writes right-handedly but she eats left-handed. She puts a knife and fork the other way around, which I find very strange. But then, I mean, she's my sister. I'm definitely right-handed, but I can't write with my left hand, but I can play the piano and I I can manipulate things with two hands. What else can I do with two? Things that I find very difficult to do left-handed are hold a pen. I can't really do it with my right hand, if I'm honest. And the other the great game that we like to play down the pub is wrong hand darts. So you have a game of darts, but you have to throw with your wrong hand, which in my case is the left. One of the guys is left-handed, so he has to throw with his right hand. And it's great because, you don't have to play darts very much before you become quite good at the technique. But as soon as you try it with your wrong hand, you sort of go like that, and the dart just hits a piece of furniture. But it's hours and hours of innocent fun, except for the people and the dogs who are in the way of the darts, obviously. Left-handed throwing is another good game. Or I should say, to be politically correct, non-dominant arm throwing.
What intrigues me about sleep is that we all crave it. We all like the idea of going to sleep, but you're not aware of being asleep when you are asleep. It's not like saying, I want a pint, because whilst you're having a pint, you're aware that you're having a pint and it's nice, but you don't know you're asleep. So does that mean really we desire oblivion, as Philip Larkin said? Beneath it all, desire of oblivion runs. Do we want to be dead? But then Shelley, another poet obviously, told us that we'd learn that sleeping isn't death. So what does it mean? Let's go back to something a bit simpler, like where did all the airships go? The longest I've ever gone without sleep, I would guess, is something like 48 hours. I don't think it's any longer than that. And there is this thing called, I can't remember exactly what it's called. Is it microsleep? You do actually sleep for, it can be a second or two whilst you're awake with your eyes open, even when somebody is talking to you. I quite often fall asleep when some people are talking to me. But it does have an effect. It does minutely restore you. So it's like plugging your almost flat iPhone in for half a minute. You get 1% more charge in it, which might just be enough to receive a text. And you keep doing that. You keep plugging yourself in for a short burst. But ultimately, I don't think I could stay awake for more than 2 days. I get bored with reality. I want to be asleep.
Have you ever been into space?
No, I've not been into space. I've been to the space equivalent zone, as the Americans call it, which is the point above which, if you were exposed to the outside atmosphere, the effect would be the same as being in space, i.e. all the fluids in your body would boil instantly, near as damn it, and you look a bit like the Nazi at the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where his face sort of melts and dissolves. That's what would happen to you. I've been up there, so I have had to wear a spacesuit in anger. And I have farted in a spacesuit. A lot of people say that it's like a fart in a spacesuit. I know what it's actually like because I've done it. Extraterrestrial life. I find this a tricky one because one theory would say if space goes on forever and the number of other heavenly bodies is infinite, then it's a bit like the monkeys in the typewriter, etc., etc., blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, it's Drake's equation, is it not, that states all the things that have to be in place in order for life to emerge on another planet. So it's got things like, an atmosphere, a certain amount of air pressure, a moon to create tides, which helps create life, and asteroid belts and things that protects us from being hit by other things flying around in space. And that makes it seem quite unlikely. But then, might life exist in a form that we don't recognise as life? Our definition of life has been made by people who have that life. How do we know that this light stand isn't a form of life to another form of life? It just doesn't seem like one to us. Who's to say we're right? Even Cromwell knew you shouldn't do that. There are all sorts of types of glass in the world. There's normal glass that you put in a window. There's safety glass, which is laminated, usually with a sheet of plastic in between it, or several sheets, as used in car windscreens, so that the glass still breaks, but the bits don't fly everywhere. You have security glass, which is a load of old broken bottles cemented into the top of a wall, so that as starving urchins with no shoes come over into your garden just to innocently nick an apple, they get shredded and then they bleed to death. But life is cheap in the suburbs. Sugar glass is used by the theatre business and in television. So when you see those scenes in a Wild West bar brawl where people run up and hit each other over the head with a bottle or throw someone through a window, that is actually glass made out of melted and cast sugar. It looks very much like glass, but it's very, very breakable. It won't hurt you if you hit somebody with it. But the problem with that is everybody, as a result of watching those old westerns, thinks it's quite amusing to hit someone over the head with a bottle. If you do it for real, you actually kill someone. There's also a type of sugar glass that a British bloke invented some years ago that is used for the, in case of emergency break glass things on trains, because those used to be made from real glass, and the irony was there would be an emergency hammer behind the glass, and to get the emergency hammer to break the window, you had to break the piece of glass over the hammer, which slashed your fingers to pieces. So you couldn't then hold the little hammer to break the big window. So you were actually condemned to die in a train crash, the blazing wreckage of a train crash, simply because no one had invented a form of sugar glass yet. Marbles are made of glass. I used to like marbles when I was a kid, and the way marbles are made is very interesting because they are formed. I've watched this on How It's Made, that American series. You form effectively a blob of glass, and they're often, the really nice ones are made by hand, rolled around on a metal edge. I'm not sure what it's called, and so you've almost got a marble, and then you snip it off, and then you put it in a series of rollers which tumble it and reverse it at the same time until it's polished into a perfect sphere, a bit like a ball bearing. Oh, ornamental glass. Well, you get a lot of that from Venice, of course. Interestingly, in the 14th century, I think it was, the value of the Venetian glassmakers' skill was so great that they were effectively contained on the islands under pain of death. And if one of them escaped, which they occasionally did, the whole city was charged with hunting him down and killing him, because if he got away, the secret of how that glass was made would spread to the wider world, which of course it did eventually. But at the time, if you took on an apprenticeship as a glassmaker on the island of Murano, you effectively went to prison. You committed yourself to staying there for the rest of your life. Or probably having your tongue cut off or something like that. Any other glass facts?
Glass beads.
Glass beads, glass...
You can cut glass underwater.
Cut it. You can remove the cork from a glass wine bottle. This isn't really a glass fact, but if you bang it bottom end first against the wall but put something soft in between, like put it inside your shoe, so there's a little bit of cushioning, banging it will send effectively, I think, an eddy current up the air in the bottle and produce a little pressure burst that will gradually make the cork pop out until it flies out and the wine goes all over your shirt. I've seen that done. And you can cut the top of a champagne bottle off with a sabre. And I've done that. If you get it wrong, it just disintegrates and the champagne goes all over the floor. But if you get it right, you have to hit it with a slight stroking action, because in that fraction of a second, the edge of the blade has to be very sharp, makes a tiny scratch in the glass, and then knocks the top off. And if you do it right, it makes a very clean cut, but you waste a lot of expensive champagne learning to do it. Just a bit stuck with glass facts now. Glass eyeballs aren't really made of glass anymore. They're made out of synthetic materials, but I can't remember quite what. But in the olden days, after the First World War and so on, when people used to lose eyes every other day, they were actually just effectively marbles that were shoved into your eye socket, so they always looked in a different direction. These days they can make them line up with your good eye. The thing that intrigues me about the idea of invisibility is that if you were invisible, you wouldn't just be able to go in the girls' changing rooms and whatever it is that everybody else talks about. You wouldn't actually need a job or any money or anything, because you could live in someone else's house, you could go to the pictures for free, you could eat for nothing in restaurants, you could hitch a lift in people's cars, and they just wouldn't know you were there. And you could nick a gobstopper from the corner shop like you used to try to when you were a kid, and they wouldn't know, apart from that the gobstopper would levitate mysteriously and then dissolve in mid-air as you sucked it away. Can I move my arms around? Is that... If I were invisible for a day, I'd play tricks on people, I think. I'd go into a pub and just drink their pint. And presumably the beer wouldn't be invisible, so a man who's probably already had a few pints would be sitting at the bar, and his pint would float into the air, and then the beer would appear to pour through the air in quite a complicated way and then settle in a puddle a few feet off the ground. I suppose even if you're invisible, you can still be punched in the face if somebody can work out where your face is. I got that right. Internet connections are confusing because, let's say, for example, well, you have, because you're listening to me, you're on your computer and you've connected to Head Squeeze, and let's say, for argument's sake, that's on my computer at home. Now you think, your computer has got to connect through the network to specifically my computer out of all the billions of computers and smartphones and tablets and whatever that there are in the world. But perhaps an easier way to think of it is that they're all connected all of the time, and the system merely ignores everything else. That's a good way to think of it. So it isn't somebody running along with a cable thinking, where's James's computer? This bloke wants to watch Head Squeeze. There it is, plunk. It's not like that. It's connected and every other one is gone out. So it's all there and yet it isn't there. I hope that helps. I bet it didn't, did it?
What were some of the first things you did on the internet?
Well, I suppose by modern standards, I'm a bit of an internet early adopter because I've had it in some form or another since the late 80s. Well, no. Yeah, since about 1988 when I started using it in publishing, but that was really specific modem connections. You really did connect your computer to another computer by putting in a string of numbers. And then obviously I got early email and had a go at some early browsers, but I don't recall what was the first thing I ever looked up on the internet. It's probably just as well I don't, because it was either something unsavoury or something deeply banal. It's probably best left to the evaporated entropy of internet history. Although I expect somebody's recorded it somewhere. Google's probably looking at it now. Do you see what James May did in 1987? Dirty bugger. I think that's what's fantastic about it. You can look stuff up, and I know all the detractors and stuckists and miserableists say, oh, well, you can't trust the internet, it's full of stuff that isn't true. Well, there is a lot of stuff on it that isn't true, obviously, because anybody can put any old rubbish on there. But if you approach it with a vaguely academic mindset, which you should do when you're looking things up in books, you can look at several sources and see this stuff is starting to match up, that's somewhere near the truth, this other stuff is rubbish. And people who bemoan the internet and say, oh, libraries were much better, forget that books were full of rubbish as well, and they were full of things that are wrong. I know this because I've written 10 books, and I know there are things in them that are wrong. I mean, not deliberately, I just made mistakes, but they're in libraries and people will pick them up and say, oh, that's interesting. Well, it isn't interesting, it's incorrect. So nothing is reliable. And the great thing about the internet is, an 8-year-old child today who's given an iPad or a smartphone for birthday will have access to 1 billion times as much knowledge as was available in the Great Library of Alexandria, and only a handful of people were allowed in there. So that can't be a bad thing, can it? More good comes out of the internet than bad. Other people say, oh, well, it's just a forum for people who want to tell you how to make bombs. Well, there are a couple of those, I'm sure, but for every one of those, there's 1 million people sharing their enthusiasm and knowledge of flower arranging or woodworking or model railways or the hits of Mark Bolan or something like that, and it just makes the world a happier and friendlier place. And you can't police it, and that's a good thing because it will help demolish oppressive regimes. End of rant. I've tried a number of dog foods. I've tried dog biscuits, which taste sort of gluey and okay, and I've tried meaty dog food in a pie, which is something we did at university. But I think that's fair enough because animals don't really get a choice in what they eat what we give them. So it seems fair that we should eat it ourselves as well. And we know that dog food is tested on human beings because you have to make sure it is actually safe for human consumption, because the tragedy is poor people eat it because it's cheap. We found this out back in the 60s and 70s in some very deprived bits of Britain. So if you go to work at a dog food factory like Spillers or Win-A-Lot, whichever one hasn't yet called the retrievers in, then one of the things you'll have to do is sit and eat some dog food. I've also tried cat munchies, which are fairly disgusting, and I've tried cattle feed, because it seems to me that I'm going to eat the cow one day. It's only fair, and it's only right really, that I try out what it's going to eat that's eventually going to be converted into cow that I eat. If you don't like the cow food, you shouldn't eat the cow.
Are you a dog person or a cat
I like dogs and cats. I get fed up with people saying that you have to make a choice. Are you a cat person or a dog person? Are you a beer man or a wine man? Are you a breast man or a buttocks man? Well, why can't you like all these things? I like cats and dogs. Cats are very therapeutic. Dogs are good fun to play with, throw a ball and all that sort of thing. I like wine, it's quite intellectual. I like beer because it makes me happy. I like all parts of naked women because I'm only human.
What's your favourite breed of dog?
My favourite breed of dog is actually the Border Collie. I've known a few. I used to have a girlfriend years ago who had a lovely one. I used to go around to see the dog, if I'm brutally honest. Richard Hammond's got a Border Collie, very, very intelligent one, which is nice. I like bright dogs. I also quite like retrievers, and I quite like actually things like Jack Russell's very small, very tough dogs, because you can sort of have a bit of a fight with them. I used to know somebody who had a Jack Russell that was so hard it could walk into the fireplace when the fire was burning and it didn't bother it. It was about 120 years old. I'm not sure it was technically alive either, but...
So do you think Border Collies are particularly bright?
I do think Border Collies are more intelligent than other dogs. It's not just, you know, when you look into their eyes, which are supposedly the window on the soul and all the rest of it. They just sort of understand stuff. And that's, you know, that's why they're sheepdogs, and that's why they live on farms, round things up and fetch things and so on. They're definitely a cut above. They're the Professor Brian Cox of dogs, only more likeable. Yes, I love airships. I've always been, even when I was a kid, I liked the idea of airships because they look so fantastic. If there's one thing I could see from the past, I think it would be a really big Hindenburg-style airship flying over a city, you know, flying over Frankfurt or London even. I think it would just look amazing. They don't fly very high airships because obviously they're not pressurised and so on, so they tended to biff around at sort of 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 feet, which would have given you a fantastic view. And they're faster than ships going across the Atlantic, but obviously not as fast as a modern aeroplane. So a typical crossing on a big Zeppelin across the Atlantic could take 2 or 3 days, depending on the weather conditions. But that's just long enough to actually make the journey an enjoyable part of your trip. You know, have very elegant dining, bit of singing around the piano, made of aluminium to save weight. You couldn't smoke. I think the Hindenburg had one room in it that was dedicated to smoking. It was asbestos lined, and it had one petrol lighter like a Zippo, which was the only lighter allowed on the aircraft, and it was chained to the table so nobody could take it out of the asbestos lined room. And that's where you're allowed to smoke. But I find the idea that it had something like 8.5 million cubic feet of hydrogen in it, and the idea that somebody sitting, you know, 10 feet below all that was allowed to spark up a petrol lighter and have a big stogie is, I wouldn't have done it. Bloody terrifying. But the idea is great. I mean, airships it's got to be the most dignified form of transport ever conceived. It's better than a yacht even. They float serenely. They're not very affected by turbulence or anything like that. You just sit there and look out of the window. Fantastic. Very expensive. The price of a transatlantic ticket from Frankfurt to where the Hindenburg crashed, and I've just forgotten what it's called, Lakehurst, would have been the equivalent back in the 30s of buying a small flat, I think, or something like that. Air travel was hideously expensive. The early flying boat trips were very expensive as well. But if you were wealthy, I think it would have been fabulous. And given that, you know, since the golden age, the 30s of the airship and the Hindenburg disaster and so on, we've got better access to helium, much better materials for making the skin out of, which is one of the very inflammable parts, much better technology for working out the structure, much better materials for making the structure so we can make it stronger, lighter, only as strong as it needs to be without chronic over-engineering. I think a modern passenger airship, I'm not talking about the New Zeppelin ones which seat sort of 15, 20 people, I'm talking about a whopper, 800 or 1,000 feet long. Storing them is a bit of an issue, I accept that.
And as a pilot, as you are, I know, do you think air travel could do a bit more Zeppelin-like glamour?
Well, I think I would be very pleased to fly, say, between London and Bristol, or maybe say from Bristol over to Ireland in an airship that flew at low altitude. It didn't necessarily go very fast, but just gave you a lovely viewing experience. I think that would be tremendous. I can't see the problem with it. They're even quite energy efficient airships because they don't go fast enough to produce terrible drag. They're relatively low friction. You don't need massive engines to power a very, very big airship. They don't carry a lot of people, that's the main issue. But of course on the original airships, because it was luxury travel, because all air travel was then, the number of staff on board was equal to the number of passengers. I think it was typically sort of 35 to 40 staff and maybe 40 passengers. So you virtually had a butler whilst you flew along. That's tremendous.
And tell me, because I did not know this, about the near naming of the Hindenburg as Hitler.
Yes, the legend has it, Hugo Echner, who took over the Zeppelin airship building company, he was a notorious pacifist and very strongly anti-Nazi, and he was very unpopular in the 30s for his anti-Nazi sentiments. And there was supposedly a plan to call the Hindenburg the Adolf Hitler, which he desperately didn't want because he was very anti-Hitler, so he named it the Hindenburg after Paul Hindenburg of the Weimar Republic before the Nazis could get their hands on it. And there is a theory that the Hindenburg crash at Lakehurst was an act of sabotage by Nazi sympathisers. It's been largely discredited from what I can make out, but for a long time there was quite a lot of research done on the idea that Echner really needed to be shamed for his incorrect non-Nazi views, and also by then the German High Command had recognised that the airship wasn't going to be very good for waging war anymore. The aeroplane was obviously the way forward. The Luftwaffe would be full of Heinkels and Dorniers, not Zeppelins, so it didn't matter if the airship was lost, and it was a good way of teaching Echner a lesson. But I find that theory pretty hard to swallow, because at a time when National Socialism was very keen to promote itself around the world, I can't see why they would deliberately destroy one of their sort of flagship items, which was this massive 800 plus foot long airship. I can't see that they'd do that.
That was really interesting. 3D film.
I was going to say the other interesting thing about airships, for people who want to get into airships, is Neville Shute, the novelist, actually worked with Barnes Wallis on the design of the R100. Barnes Wallis of Bouncing Bomb and Dam Busters fame. But prior to that, he worked on the R100, which was Britain's privately funded airship project. Barnes Wallis was the chief engineer. Neville Shute was his chief calculator, as he was then called. He wrote a book called Slide Rule, all about building the airship and so on, and it's fantastic. But one of the difficulties of building a thing like an airship structure back then was that obviously it's made up of a series of frames, octagonal or whatever shape, and they have to be made from drilled and punched aluminium pieces, and then they're braced longitudinally and across with wires that are under tension to keep the whole thing rigid. But every single point had to be worked out mathematically, and in those days a calculator, what we'd now take to mean a little device that you put in your pocket, a calculator was a person, that was a job, being a calculator, and you sat there and you did arithmetic, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of calculations that had to be done on this whole massive structure to make sure that it would work. And if one of them was wrong, and of course one of them would be because you didn't get them all right, you had to go back and pick your way through and try and work out where the mistake was. Now if you design an airship today, finite element analysis computers and so on would be able to work out exactly what shape it would be quite quickly and without over-engineering it, so it would be stronger and even lighter than it was. So, I mean, if they could do it back then with pencils and pieces of paper, we should be able to make a cracking airship these days. It's well worth reading the Neville Shute book.
Neville Shute and the town called
Alice. Town called Alice, that's. Penny farthings, I've only ever tried one once. They are quite easy to ride because they've got a very big front wheel. They only had a big front wheel because chain technology hadn't developed to the point where they could drive the back wheel indirectly. The pedals are straight onto the wheel. So to get the gearing right, the front wheel has to be very big. But the interesting thing about penny farthings is they generally have completely straight forks, so you don't get much of that rake and trail thing. There is a little bit because the steering head often has a slight angle on it. But despite having such a massive wheel and being inherently so stable, they are very, very twitchy. And you have appalling accidents falling off penny farthings because you're hundreds of feet up in the air. And Victorian safety helmets were made out of brass, probably.
What's your opinion cyclists on the roads?
My opinion of cyclists on the roads. Well, I approve of bicycles because I haven't been without one since I was about 3 years old. I hate people who bought a bicycle 2 weeks ago and then start lecturing me about it as if the rest of the world has never heard of them or doesn't realise what they're good for. They are good for local journeys. I've done some big bicycle rides. I've cycled the length of Britain. I've cycled from London to Paris several times. I've cycled all the way across France through the Loire Valley. Don't lecture me about what bicycles are good for and how they're going to save the earth, because I know. And you can't carry a new television on one or a vase. But basically bicycles are one of the most important inventions of all time. They are a great liberator. There's no cost at the point of use, as I think the marketing people would say. You just need to eat a Mars bar or something to make sure you've got enough energy, and then you can go around the world on a bicycle. It simply increases the efficiency of the human machine, because for a given amount of effort from your legs, you go a lot further on a bicycle than you would walking. It's brilliant. I don't know why we didn't evolve with wheels.
Do you know why you don't extinguish an oil fire with water?
Because the oil would float on the water and the fire would spread around. That's why you use foam to put out big fires from aeroplane crash landings and petrol stations going up at the end of films and things, because you have to use something lighter than the fuel so that it removes the oxygen. Is that right?
Yep.
You see, we don't just read this off a script, we actually know what we're talking about. I've tried a water and oil fire. Yeah, I tried it with a bit of petrol once. Lit it and then sprayed it with a hose pipe to see what happened, and it just moved off down the drive. Stupid thing to do. Don't do that at home. Or at least point it away from the garage door, not into it, because that's really stupid.
How do you think they get different coloured fireworks then?
Different coloured fireworks? Oh, well, that's a result of different chemical compounds burning with particular colours. And I used to know some of these because I once made some fireworks, and I'm really ashamed to say I've pretty much forgotten them. Magnesium is white, obviously, we all know that from chemistry. Green, what made the green balls?
Copper sulfate?
It was copper sulfate, wasn't it? Yeah, which you put in powdered form into little pellets, and then the red ones were...
Iron, isn't it?
It must have been...
Iron, ferrous sulfate.
Something like that, yeah, made red balls. Anyway,
Ferrous sulfate.
yeah, various different chemical compounds produce different colours when burned, and then you form those into pellets or into powders that burst out. And fireworks technology is fascinating. The only thing that's interesting, or maybe interesting is the wrong word, inevitable about fireworks making, is that every fireworks factory in the world eventually blows up. They always do. So you can make fireworks home, you have to get a license, but you can do it. You can do it in your garage, but you will blow your house up. Maybe not next week, maybe not in the next 10 years, but eventually you will. I've made some fireworks, yes, on Man Lab, another program I made. We made a rocket. The annoying thing is the rocket itself didn't work properly, but the bits in the nose cone that came out to make the red and yellow balls and go bang, they worked a treat. Unfortunately, because the rocket didn't work very well, they all came out and made red and yellow balls and went bang right in someone's back garden. But it was quite successful apart from that. When I was a boy, and I'm talking about the age of 10 or 11, a box of matches was 2p. And there was nothing more exciting that you could spend 2p on, really, than a box of matches and set things on fire, including your mates. It was brilliant fun. I suppose that sort of thing is very frowned upon these days. And of course, back then, I don't want to sound like an old man, but we had a lot of, well, not safety matches. So what do you call those? Danger matches? I don't know, the red-tipped ones that you would strike on anything. So you could put them on the bottoms of your shoes and then ride your bicycle along, put your feet on the ground and have flames leap out of the side of your soles. Stuff like that. It was just fantastic fun. Hours and hours and hours of harmless fun. I mean, a few people burned to death, but, you know, we just thought that was normal back then. Jonesy bought it today. He got set on fire whilst we were strapping matches to the back wheel of his bicycle, but you accepted a certain number of casualties back in the early 70s. The other thing that was good fun with the old red-headed danger matches, and I don't know very many people who know this, I was shown this actually by my grandfather, so it must be an ancient trick, but you get the match and you pull off a little bit of tin foil and you wrap it very tightly around the red end of the match and then screw the end into a point. And then if you rest that horizontally, usually on the side of the matchbox itself, and hold another match under it, or put a little meths burner from your chemistry set under the red-tipped, wrapped in the silver foil, eventually it reaches a temperature where the red tip effectively explodes and the pressure bursts out of the tinfoil and the match flies like a rocket across the room. And if you spend half your teenage years making hundreds of these, two of you can be at opposite sides of a room, line them all up and just have a battle firing matchstick rockets at each other until one of you gets hit in the eyeball. Brilliant. Did you do that? It's great fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
Life was simple in the old days. We didn't have the iPad, we just had matches. But most of us are still alive.
Great.
Very close to the root of civilization, in fact.
Yes, it is. I mean, that was man's red fire, and we had it in our pockets, bought with our pocket money. And I suppose some people did get hurt, but if you wanted to be really pedantic and anal about it, you could probably work out how many people have been knocked over by motor vehicles crossing the road trying to text. So the world hasn't really got any safer. The danger area's just moved around a bit. We used to fall off bicycles. These days, young people die of obesity because they play Call of Duty too much. So what? Yeah, trees. I mean, everybody understands, I think, that you count the rings in a tree to know how old it is. 1 ring equals 1 year. That's pretty standard stuff. But it's when you start matching trees together to build up a picture of growth patterns throughout history, that's when it becomes interesting. So you find a ring in a tree that matches a ring in another tree, but that was cut down a long time ago, but was known to be X number of years old then. And then you've got those two bits. If you imagine the records then overlap, say, like that, you've got that bit of that tree, and then you've got another 100 or 150 years in that tree. And then if you've got another one, you get another one again, and you get a sort of climate record, because you can say, we now know that that's the year 1798, and it was a good summer, because count back the right number of rings, get to that summer, lots of growth, ace, good summer. It's not about sort of environmentalism so much, it's about knowing what the patterns of the weather have been, and it's all recorded in trees. They're like the sort of, it's a very simple idea, they're like the punched tapes of climatic history. It's all those sticks that ancient tribes had with, you know, the whole history of their people in 36 notches and a squiggle. It's that sort of thing. It's good. And then you can use it to date anything that's made of wood, because once you've done a lot of this, you have records that are available to all researchers saying this summer produced this size ring, this pattern was from this part of the 19th century. And then if you find that pattern in something like the rafters of the roof of an old building or the structure of a ship, or even, I suppose, something that's been repaired at a later date, you can date that bit of wood and know when that happened. But what it doesn't tell you, of course, is if that was done using a piece of wood that was from a tree that was 200 years old but cut down 50 years previously. So it all gets quite complicated. But it's good. It's a lot better than just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This tree is 53 years old. Or was. But now you've cut it down, obviously.
Have you ever carved anything into a tree?
I've never carved my name in a tree, I don't think. Well, I've carved it into a desk, which was made from a tree, but not actually into the living tree. I have whittled things out of bits of tree, though, when I was a kid with a penknife. I know it sounds like something from Just William, but we were very poor. So a piece of wood and an old penknife that you found on the beach was several months of entertainment. The cameraman's nodding because he did it as well. Yeah, I don't know how old Jeremy Clarkson's head is. If I knew more about prehistory, I'd probably be able to date it by working out what sort of dinosaur it is, but I don't. So the alternative, I suppose, would be to cut it in half and count the rings. And I would imagine there are a couple of 100,000.
Radar is not... It's not a rich seam of comedy gold or anything like that. I mean, radar's pretty dull, really. It's just a load of waves going out and coming back, and some pictures, you know, some blobs that appear on the screen and people hovering over it going, yes, I think so, Wing Commander, and all that stuff. Well, it actually used to be more complicated. In the early days of World War II radar, you had to, as you were saying in that piece, simplify it because it's quite complicated, but you had, you know, antenna, big, almost like massive pylons sending out the radio waves, and then the return would come to a receiver. But you'd have to have several of these things, and you'd have to compare all the returns to work out a sort of simple triangulation on, say, the squadron of aeroplanes. But they also had to incorporate a system of comparing them all and knocking out what was obviously a misreading.
We've got this idea into our heads that, you know, you look at a radar screen and you see pictures of aeroplanes coming and aeroplanes coming over here, which you do in the cockpit of a modern airliner because it's all being interpreted electronically and displayed as a handy visual graphic. But the early radar, you used to get a dot on a screen. And that dot in itself didn't tell you enough. You had to know about another dot on another screen and compare them and then eliminate dots that were obviously bogus. And I expect they got it wrong quite a lot of the time. Oh, there are fishing radar as well. I mean, I think they are sonar, they're a sonic, but it's still the same thing. You still send the signal out and measure the return. You can do it with radio waves, you can do it with sound waves, or you can do it with things outside of what we would call the audible spectrum, so ultrasonic ones. You can probably do it with low-level pulses in water as well, to find that there's a huge whale in front of you or something like that.
The second is the duration of 9,192,631,770. My relationship with time is generally quite good. I don't really like people being late. I don't really like people being early either, to be honest. But I've often wondered what it actually is. I mean, time is a construct, obviously. What is a second? How do you know what it is if you can't look at something that shows you what a second is? Same for an inch or a millimetre or 50 grams. If you're on a desert island and you didn't have a point of reference, you wouldn't be able to say, well, it's that. We don't actually know what any of these things are. We're just told them and we accept it. What if it's not true? Turns out in the case of the second, it isn't true. That's why you're always 0.6 of a second late every year. The interesting thing about itching is we're all conscious of it. We all know that we do it, but at the same time we're not conscious of it. And it's only when you start thinking about itching that you realise you do itch all the time. But then the problem with that is thinking about itching does make you itchy. And watching this will make you itchy. And watching animations of people having a scratch will make you want to scratch. So it's very difficult to be truly scientific about it. I know, I've got itchy ear. How much do you itch normally? You do it in your sleep. You're not aware of it. You scratch yourself constantly. But I was wondering, what's the most embarrassing itch situation you've ever been in? Have you ever been second in line to meet the Queen at a ceremony and then been overcome with a debilitating desire to scratch your...
I suppose pus is potentially disgusting, but the great thing is that it does mean that you are winning the battle against infection and bacteria and all of that sort of thing. And with the best will in the world, much as we might like to try and deny it, pus is quite sort of satisfying when it comes out. My best pus experience was as a small boy, 8 or 9 years old. I had a boil on my leg. It must have been a boil formed by an infection of the very first hair follicle I developed. And it grew quite big and it was very sore and I didn't like it. And then one day I touched it and it went, and a sort of cone of fairly rubbery pus came out of my leg and left a sort of borehole behind. And it was so incredibly cathartic. It was as if all the terrors of childhood, all the concerns of my infancy had become this plug, and I expunged it. And after that, I was made whole and became a man. I presume that little plug is still lying around somewhere, wherever we lived at the time, near Bristol, on the floor. I'm pretty sure it hasn't dissolved or anything like that. It was like a piece of ivory.
When I was 16 and 17, I used to have a Saturday job in a jewellery shop, and that's when I learned that the markup on diamonds was really almost criminal, because a man would come in full of joy and he'd buy an engagement ring, which in those days might have cost 200 quid, say, and then a month later he'd come back wanting to sell it back to the shop and we'd give him 30 or 35 quid. That was it. He had been robbed as well as jilted. And you could see the ones who were going to come back. You could see the doubt in their eyes. And we converted that doubt into hard profit by selling them worthless chips of rock. It's tough, isn't it? That's why I'm not married. Think of the money I've saved. I could have a massive train set instead. But what about gems, those cut and polished monsters that hang provocatively in the cleavages of
Joan Armatrading. I don't mean Joan Armatrading, Elizabeth Taylor. Kim Kardashian, isn't it? Kardashian. Yes, they are relatively rare, but I still don't see that makes them particularly valuable. I don't even find them particularly beautiful to look at. I'd rather see a ruby or a sapphire or something like that, or even coloured glass. I think that looks fantastic, but diamonds just don't do it for me. That would have made a great Bond film, wouldn't it? Diamonds don't do it for me. Probably wouldn't have lasted very long, though. I laugh at either absurd things or really childish, puerile stuff about pooing and trumping and all that sort of thing. I find words funny. I think the funniest word in the world is scribble. Scribble always makes me laugh, and cheese is a funny word, and fluffy is a funny word. What else is a funny word? Can you think of any funny words? Words that are just funny. Some words are funny if you say them over and over again. We're all familiar with that. But the word scribble, this goes back to when I was a child, when a teacher gave me a new exercise book. You used to have to go and queue up at a sort of window. This is all very workhouse-ish. And you'd show your full exercise book that had been signed by the teacher, and then you're allowed to have a new one. And the bloke gave it to me, and he said, "It's wasted on you, May, you'll just fill it with scribble." Which was true. I did fill it with scribble because I couldn't write properly, but I just find the word scribble, when people say, "Oh no, he scribbled all over it," it makes me roll up. I'm going to start laughing in a minute at it. Scribble. And cheese is a funny word. You can't just say cheese, you have to say cheese. Can anybody just say, "I'd like some cheese, please"? I can't. If I'm in a restaurant, I say, "Oh, could I have some cheese?" Cheese is a funny word? The cameraman is smirking slightly. Do you find cheese a funny word?
I don't know why, but I do.
It is a funny word. Is cheese a funny word amongst young people?
Yeah, I do.
Cheese?
I think we've got a full house for cheese.
Cheese is a funny word. Fluffy's quite a funny word. I laugh a lot at sort of lame descriptions that are better than the correct word. So if you say inflatable paddling pool, that's correct. But it makes me laugh when people say, "Oh, I've got a blow-up paddling pool." Or it's like see-through handbag rather than transparent. They say, "Oh, it's see-through." Well, see-through is a stupid way of describing it. It's really, really childish. But it's better, I think, and blow-up is better. Licky-sticky, meaning self-adhesive. People say, "Oh, it's licky-sticky," meaning you go that and stick it on. Like those little sucker cup things you put on the fridge. They're licky-sticky.
When was the last time you had a good laugh?
Oh, I haven't had a good laugh now, probably for 20 years. Life's been so tough, really. And it just hasn't been funny. It's very difficult to find it funny when it just isn't. I suppose, no, seriously, my last big laugh. What was the last thing that actually... I like that moment in laughter where you think it will actually kill you. It's almost like drowning. You think, I cannot find this not funny for long enough to regain a whole lungful of breath to sustain my body and my brain. I quite like that sensation because it's sort of frightening as well as being funny. And I also like it, I've had this on some things on the television where you've got a sentence that you think is funny. I had one of these on another programme I make about the police not having the legal authority to measure children before deciding whether or not they could ride in the front of a car. They do not have the... They do not have the legal...
I can't wait for this now. The legal...
Because they do not have the legal right to measure children. To just measure them. Just say if you see a policeman measuring your children, you think, quick, call the... And I had to read this line on the television. I couldn't get to the end of it. It was only about 12 words long. I couldn't get to the end of it without laughing. And the fact that I couldn't get to the end of it without laughing became funny in itself. And I did, I don't know, 50 takes, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't say, the police have revealed that they do not have the legal authority to measure children. I can do it now because it's not funny anymore. But at the time, it was gut-bustingly amusing. So the funniest people in the world are the people who aren't actually funny. And nothing has ever been funny when narrated with the prefix, "oh, it was really funny." That is a sign. It's like people who say, "I'm not being racist or anything." It just means they are. Well, actually, it's not like that, because people who start off by saying, "oh, it was really funny the other day," it wasn't.
I chose this snot question because snot is obviously horrible, especially on other people and on door handles, but it's also strangely fascinating. And although I had a vague idea of where snot comes from, I didn't know why your nose runs so much in the winter or why a cold is called a cold. But now I do. Snotters. What is the worst cold you've ever had? Obviously, if you're a man, supposedly it'll have been much worse than the one you would have had you been born a woman. And you'll probably call it man flu, but it doesn't exist. I've actually been in a proper spacesuit when I went up in the US Air Force U-2 spy plane a few years ago. If the aeroplane went wrong, the pressurized system failed or the canopy blew off, you would be relying on the spacesuit to pressurize you and feed you oxygen and make you survive. Otherwise, you would boil away in a few minutes. Has anybody out there ever been on an airline or any form of aeroplane that has decompressed? Because it's extremely rare. But it can happen, which is why you have the oxygen mask that will fall down in front of your face and that can be attached by the 2 rubber bands behind your head. Please secure your own oxygen mask before helping other people. It is fascinating to see how little atmosphere there actually is and how much it has achieved. As a sort of bang for buck ratio, the atmosphere scores better than pretty much anything else we've got. It's this tiny little fog of air above the Earth for 5 or 6 kilometres, and everything that's happened on the Earth and that hasn't happened on the other planets in the solar system is because of that. That's all it is. Okay, so here's a question. If all the air in the atmosphere was condensed into the form of water, how deep would the puddle be covering all the landmass on Earth? Sorry, that is a bit of a confusing question, but you get the gist of it. Basically, if you turn the atmosphere into water, how deep would it be? Why can you see through glass? It's an interesting question, and we all sort of know, well, yes, you can see through it because it's transparent, but why? And it does get quite confusing because ultimately it's a bit of a quantum physics explanation. And some of you are going to write in and say, yes, you've treated light as particles, but we all know it's actually a wave. But is it? It depends on what experiment you're doing. This is why we have this thing called wave-particle duality in light. And the great thing about the internet is, if you have a complaint about the way I've explained it, you can simply fill in one of these boxes and put, as a glazier, I was deeply offended by your explanation of light as particles. We all know it's a wave. Tap away. That's what this is for. And anyway, I'm right. Okay. Given that glass is such an ancient invention, I mean, it goes back to the Middle Ages, really, in Europe, and maybe even earlier than that elsewhere, why has it never really been improved? I know we've got plate glass and all the rest of it, and toughened glass for car windscreens, but the stuff in your windows, on the front of the clock over there that you can't see, and pub glasses, they just break too easy. Why has there never been an unbreakable pub glass? And I know there's Pyrex, which you use to make those sort of slightly opaque teacups that you used to take camping. Well, why do things taste terrible out of Pyrex? Because it's still just glass, isn't it? Why would it make it taste different? It's not like polystyrene or cardboard. Anyway, are there any applications for glass that you can think of that no one else has thought of yet? I've come up with a glass gearbox for a motorcycle, because then you could ride along watching all the bits working. But not for very long, obviously.